Hey everybody, Teching here. Let me start this off by telling you a little bit of a story. We're going way back, ladies and gentlemen. All the way back to Volume 1 of a little-known manga by the name of One Piece. The year is 1997, and the very first chapter of One Piece, titled Romance Dawn, is published in Shonen Jump magazine. All right? And in this chapter, there's a villain. This man right here, by the name of Higuma the Mountain Bandit. He's got a bounty of 8 million berries. He's rude, he's crude, and he's got a crew. So you know not to mess with this guy right here. On this particular day, Higuma decided to walk down into the town with his rude, crude crew and have a drink at Party's bar. But the thing is, Higuma, being as rude and crude as he is, doesn't just open a door. He's the boss of the entire island, right? He kicks open that door. It's like a saloon-style door, you know? Like from Back to the Future Part 3, which is the only Western I've ever watched. Anyway, he kicks open the door to the bar and he walks in. And who does he find in the bar other than Shanks and some kid and some lady behind the bar with green hair that did really good in a crossover tournament lately? But who cares about that? He's the boss of Dawn Island. He needs to show them who's in charge around here, right? Him and his crew. So he takes out his sword and he breaks a bunch of bottles and he breaks one, pours it over Shanks' head just to kind of send a message. You know what I mean? And then he turns around and he goes to walk out of the bar. And as he does so, he places his hand right there on the door that he just kicked in. This is where we get into the story of the traveling carpenter Minatomo, who was wandering by at that exact moment and can't possibly let a broken door be left broken. So in the background, completely unbeknownst to everybody, not just Shanks, Luffy, Makino, and even the readers, Minatomo repairs that entire door in the entire moment that Higuma and his crew were inside of the bar. So when they left, they didn't even notice how quick that repair was. All right, so here is the Retcon video, ladies and gentlemen. There's a lot of moments in One Piece where Oda makes mistakes, whether they be art mistakes or in the background or major ones that can actually affect the lore or the power system of One Piece that have to be corrected later in one way or another. Maybe they get corrected from the magazine release to the volume release, or maybe they get corrected in an SBS, or maybe they get corrected in a data book like Blue Deep or the Vivra card. And in a lot of cases, sometimes they are corrected multiple times. So there's a few of these that are well known in the One Piece story that we're going to be going into today. It's not an exhaustive list, certainly. But before we even get into that, I had to sit down and think about, what even constitutes a retcon, all right? So first of all, retcon is the combination of two words, okay? Retroactive continuity. You have to say it like a superhero announcer from the 1950s. It's retroactive continuity, man! You know, something like that, right? Okay. It's effectively going back into the story from something that occurred before, and then later on retroactively changing it, essentially saying, oh, this didn't happen, or it happened differently, or it was always this way, never that way. That's essentially what a retcon is. Now, in the world of fiction, not all media is presented or released in the same way, right? So like a movie, for example, you could have the first part of a movie be in theaters, and then in the second movie, the sequel, they could essentially go back and say, oh no, that's not what happened in this movie, it was actually this that happened here. If you've ever seen, the one I immediately think of is Halloween H2O, the ending of that movie, what happens to Michael Myers, and then immediately in the following movie, Halloween Resurrection, which is just a phenomenal film. They completely changed the ending of H2O. Like, no, that's not actually what happened. It's a completely different thing that happened. That's sort of the idea of retcon. Now, when it comes to manga, it's a little different because The chapters are originally released in Shonen Jump, individually, one at a time. This is a volume I got while I was in Japan a few months ago. This is the first chapter of Nice Prison was in this. Then, after a few months, those chapters are compiled together in what is called a volume, or a tankobon, all right? Now, this creates an interesting little paradigm here that doesn't exist for all sorts of media, all right? So, in the instance here, let's say that in the chapter release of One Piece, Oda forgets to, maybe not necessarily forgets, but doesn't have time to finish certain line work or something. Actually, that happened during Kuma's backstory. In fact, Oda even apologized for it in the chapter. He said on the cover, like, hey, I couldn't finish all of the chapter exactly. A part of it's going to be like sketches and not really filled out entirely. Sorry about that. And then later on, when the volume came out, that was all cleaned up and fixed, all right? So that's interesting, just in terms of the way that manga is released compared to, like, novels. I guess a comparison there would be, like, different editions of the same book. You know, like, the first edition comes out, there's an error in the book somewhere, and then by the time the second edition comes out, they fix that, okay? So let me ask you, and this is the question I was sort of asking myself while making this video, like, setting everything up. Is an art mistake in the magazine that is later corrected in the tankobon, is that considered a retcon? So, like, the most recent example, I would say, is at the beginning of Elbaf in chapter 1127, when Luffy and everybody was running around Rhodes' Lego City, right? The outfits that the Straw Hats are wearing, they switched up, like, a lot, you know, like, and so people to the point where people were wondering, like, if that was intentional, like, wait a minute, are the Straw Hats, like, hallucinating right now? Is this, like, a dream, you know? In one panel, Luffy has a sword on his back as part of his Elbaf outfit, but then it changes into an axe, but then it changes back to a sword or something, right? Like, it changes between panels. In the manga volume release later, Oda corrects that, and it's like an axe the entire way through. So it was a change. So I guess it was a retcon, right? And there's like two schools of thought I've seen about this. One school of thought is whatever is released in the magazine, that's the original release. That's what it is. Anything that changes from the magazine to the tankobon is considered a retcon. And then another school of thought is nothing is really finalized until it hits the shelves as a volume. So any mistakes that are made in the magazine, that's like the preliminary release, okay? That's like whatever. This is the thing that you're actually going to buy in the store. This is how you're actually going to read the chapters later, unless you go back and you buy all the back copies of like Shonen Jump or something. This is the way that you're probably going to read the One Piece manga mainly, right? Okay. And obviously we have like online stuff like Viz and everything like that. You can read them online, of course. But which one do you apply to, I guess? Which one do you say that, like, oh, no, whatever in the magazine is dead set, anything that changes after that is a retcon? Or are you more like, no, it's okay if there was some mistakes here. Anything that makes it to the volume, that is therefore considered canon. Now, this brings us back to the curious case of the carpenter Minatomo, and how Oda will actually utilize retcons as a sort of tongue-in-cheek way of adding new characters or concepts into the story of One Piece. And it's actually kind of funny how Oda does this. It's essentially Oda being like, oops, I made a mistake. I'm going to correct that mistake, but I'm also going to add something to the story to make up for the mistake, I guess. So, in the case with Minatomo, in Volume 7 of the SBS, that's when somebody asks, hey, Oda, you know, Higama broke the door when he was going into the bar, and then it was fixed later. How did that happen? And Oda's like, there's a carpenter guy by the name of Minatomo, and he fixed the door. Now, that character, who cares, right? Except later on, when we get to Wano, we see another character also named Minatomo, and Oda even went to clarify, no, they're not the same character. They're like brothers. They're related. They're twins that were separated when Kozaburo Shimosuke fled Wano 55-something years ago to go to the East Blue, and that was part of Minatomo's group. That's that kind of stuff right there where Oda doesn't just be like, yeah, there's a guy named Minatomo, he's a carpenter, whatever, who cares? Just created a character for no reason. No, that character ended up actually not being like super relevant, but ended up being included in the back lore of Wano 1,000-something chapters later, almost 1,000 chapters, like 900-something chapters later, Oda's like, wait a minute, there's going to be a guy on Wano who is the brother of Minatomo, who's also named Minatomo, and they're going to have like a backstory where one stayed on Wano and the other one went to the East Blue with Kozaburo, and that's why he was at Party's bar to fix the door. And so there's a few examples of that in the story. One such example that we're going to start off here is Mr. 3 floating on the water. So in chapter 175, we see Mr. 3 in the basement of Rain Dinners, defeated by the Straw Hats. I always say that Crocodile beat him up, but no, it was actually like Sanji that beat him up and then took the key and then opened the cage to let all the other Straw Hats out. Crocodile walks in on Mr. 3 being unconscious, floating on the water. Now, Mr. 3 is a Devil Fruit user. He has the Doru Doru no Mi. Devil Fruit users, canonically, very importantly, cannot swim and cannot float. They sink in every form of water there is, okay? So, this was an error. And of course, somebody brought this up in an SBS later. Wait a minute, Oda-sensei. Mr. 3 is a Devil Fruit user. How is he floating on the water? And Oda came up with another example, kind of the same thing with Minatomo. He was like, yeah, there's this, like, really, you didn't see it in the manga, but like underneath Galdino, there was this like super floaty, buoyant type of wood that he was actually floating on. Now in the anime, they actually included it. They actually included the table that he's kind of like, he's like, knocked out on floating on a table in the water to make that make sense. Whatever, it's okay, fine. You made a mistake and you're just like, oh, there was actually a piece of wood. Later on, at the end of the Fishman Island arc, as the Straw Hats were leaving Fishman Island, they had to float back up to the surface in their ship, in the Sunny that had been coated. How did they get the ship up to the surface? They use an extremely, unbelievably floaty, buoyant type of wood called Kui-Gosu. Kui-Gosu is the opposite of, it's taking the words Sugoi Uku backwards. Sugoi Uku means floating unbelievably, or this stuff floats really well. All right? So that was something, once again, where Oda's like, how am I going to get the Straw Hats back up to the surface? They need to, like, attach something to the Straw Hats to the Sunny to get it to float up. Wait a minute, super floaty wood. So I guess that table right there was made out of the same stuff. So not every retcon is like this. Not everyone Oda like incorporates into the story. Some are just honest mistakes that he has to just fix later, and we'll get to those here in a moment. But those are the ones that I find funny, the ones that Oda actually incorporates into the story in other ways, all right? It's pretty neat. Let's move on to Katakuri next, because the retcon involving him and his Devil Fruit specifically, I remember quite well because I was actually reviewing the chapters when this happened, all right? Oh, by the way, I don't know if I've mentioned, but retcon is just the combination of two words. Rewritten continuity, but you gotta say it as like a superhero announcer from the 50s. Rewritten continuity! Anywho, so Dogtooth, as he was translated back then. Remember the old days? Like, Charlotte Dogtooth? Oh, no! That's not really a retcon. That's more of just a mistranslation. All right, but Charlotte Katakuri has the power of the Mochi Mochi no Mi, right? And in chapter 863, Jinbei was the one that said and was kind of warning Luffy, hey, Luffy, be careful. Dogtooth has a Logia, the Mochi Mochi no Mi. Now, this one, if I remember correctly, was not, it was changed in the Tankobon later, in volume 86, is when that one was altered, okay? So in the actual volume release, it does say Special Paramecia, it was changed. I think it was either in that edition of Shonen Jump or the later edition, like for the following chapter, which would have been 864, there was a note in the magazine from Oda. There was like an editor's note or something that said, by the way, Katakuri's Devil Fruit is not a Logia as previously stated. It is a Special Paramecia. So this is a little unusual, right? This isn't just like Oda slipped up when writing something. It seems to me Oda originally did intend Katakuri to have a Logia and drew out his powers and expanded them based off of that premise. Now, I don't know exactly what happened here, and a good chunk of this, who knows, what Oda was thinking at the time, or if like an editor came up to him and said, hey, Oda-sensei, is this right, or is this supposed to be a Logia? I have no idea. But at some point, I think Oda sat down, or it was brought up to him that, like, maybe this doesn't work as well with the other Logias. You think about, like, the Goro Goro no Mi, which is lightning, or the Magu Magu no Mi, which is magma, right? Or the Pika Pika no Mi, which is light. These are all like elements and things like that, right? And so Mochi, not a natural element, maybe it doesn't really fit into the Logia category. And this is not something as insignificant as a door, reappearing on its hinges, or Luffy having a sword and then an axe that doesn't even, it's not relevant to anything. It's just like a costume for him, really. This is something that actually does affect the power system in the One Piece world. You got to be careful when retconning your power system. You don't want that to be messed up, right? All right. So, and then I'm more of a stickler for that. If you start changing the power system around all the time, that's an issue, right? Okay. So, it's actually changed to special paramecia. What does that mean? We don't know. It's never actually been clarified what makes it so special. I guess the idea that it's a paramecia, but has properties similar to a Logia, but not exactly like a Logia, hence why it's special paramecia. All right, so that's a retcon. It involves Katakuri. He does have a paramecia, and that's a big deal because Logias can go intangible and all that stuff, and typically they're always like a natural element that exists, and that's been the baseline that we've had up until now. So I think Oda, maybe he was like, oh yeah, he's a Logia with Mochi. And maybe he was on the fence of it belonging in that category, and then eventually he was like, it's a Logia, and then after it's released, it's like, wait, no, that doesn't make sense. Let's make it a special paramecia. So, like, a notice had to be published with, like, by the way, this was an error. It's actually paramecia. Now, since we're already on the topic of devil fruits, let's just keep with that because there's a few other devil fruit recons in the story. By the way, recon, it's a combination of two words. It's recalibrated continuity. So there you go. That makes sense there. You just have to say it like an announcer. Recalibrated continuity. All right. So first off, we have Reiju Vinsmoke. Is she a devil fruit user? No, she isn't. However, in an edition of the One Piece magazine, it was stated that she did have some form of devil fruit that allowed her to manipulate poisons. At the time, it was thought to be some kind of like butterfly zone because, Magellan already had the Venom no Mi, which deals with poisons. So if, Reiju could turn into like a poisonous butterfly or something, and that's how she was able to absorb the poisoning from Luffy in the hot, hot sea, all right? Now, in reality, she doesn't have a devil fruit. None of the German siblings do, or Judge for that matter. They get their unique abilities through genetic modification and the use of their raid suits. However, the raid suits just augment their natural abilities, like we did see Niji able to use his lightning abilities even when he wasn't wearing the raid suit. So even though she doesn't always have the raid suit on, Reiju can still like absorb poisons and have poison-based abilities, and poisons like wouldn't work on her very much. So this one is a little different because it's not like Oda directly said in her introduction box that Reiju Vinsmoke is the user of the poison butterfly Zoan or something like that. No, this was something that wasn't stated at all whether or not she had a devil fruit or not, and then in a magazine it was stated that she did. So did Oda provide the information for that magazine, or was that somebody that was just writing the article, or were some wires getting crossed? Not really sure about this. I don't know how like the One Piece magazine people communicate with Oda's staff and Shueisha and the editors. Something happened at some point where someone told the person in the magazine that Reiju has a devil fruit ability, so they published it. Was it Oda himself? I have no idea. But it was there, and then so people thought for a little while Reiju did have one, and then later it was confirmed that none of the Germa siblings do. Then we also have a famous example of... This is something Oda, I think, like he set up as like, oh, this is going to be a thing I'm going to reveal throughout the story, but it just fell apart really quick. Pell has been on record saying there are only 5 devil fruits that grant flight in the world. Oh boy, howdy, Pell. Just like, okay. So this one has actually, I've heard so many different explanations of this, ways that you can couch what he meant by that, all right? So a lot of people have said, well, you know, there's a devil fruit encyclopedia, and that devil fruit encyclopedia doesn't have every single fruit. So Pell was only referring to devil fruits that were in the encyclopedia. Also, people have said, well, Pell wasn't referring to every single devil fruit. He was only referring to zones. And even further than that, people have said, well, he wasn't referring to ancient zones or mythical zones. No, no. He was only referring to 5 standard regular zones that grant the ability of flight. Let's go through the normal, just everyday zones. Not mythical, not ancient, not anything like that. Here are just the normal-ass zone users in the One Piece world. All right, so on the top there, we have Pell. He could transform into a falcon. That can fly. So that's number 1. Let's see here. Going down. Pierre doesn't count because he's a bird that ate the horse fruit. That's different. Let's stop right at Kabu and Beyond, who are 2 members of the Tontada tribe at Dressrosa. Kabu can turn into a beetle, and Beyond can turn into a hornet. They have the power of the Mushi Mushi Nomis, the insect zones, who are both able to fly. So that is 2, and that is 3 right there. Then we have Morgans, who has the power of the Tori Tori Nomi model Albatross. Now, I'm going to pause here because Morgans has specifically stated that he is unable to fly when he's in his hybrid form, or he's unable to fly maybe period. This is very unusual because he has the power of a bird zone, and he's an albatross nonetheless. Albatrosses are known to fly very far, and they can fly for a very long time. So you can include him here if you wish. I kind of do, because even though he personally, maybe he's just overweight and can't physically fly, he hasn't been shown to fly, but it doesn't make any sense for the user of a bird fruit to not be able to fly. So I don't think it's the fruit's problem. I think it's Morgan's problem. I think he needs to lay off, like, the chocolate cake or the Twinkies or whatever he's eating, okay? I think there's a reason why he cannot fly, but any other user of that fruit would be able to fly. So if you include the Tori Tori Nomi model Albatross, that is 4. Then on the bottom, we have Stussy, who consumed the Bato Bato Nomi. She could turn into like a vampire bat, and she gets bat wings. Once again, hesitant to include her because we didn't actually see her fly during Egghead, but she did have wings. So I'm going to include it. I'm going to include that's the 5. All right, I'm going to include that's the 5 right there. So I suppose if Pell was only referring to zones and only referring to normal zones, I suppose he is accurate in that way. Tamago can turn into a chicken, but chickens and roosters, they can at least, canonically in our world, can't fly. They can kind of, like, you know, flutter a little bit, but that's kind of it, right? Okay, that's all there is there, okay. But if we go further than that and we look at the mythical zones over here, oh boy, Pell is so totally wrong. Marco is a phoenix. Kaido is a dragon. Let's see, who else can fly here? Stronger has the Pegasus zone. We have Marcus Mars that could transform into the Itsumade, right? He can fly as well. So there's even more in the mythical category. And then if we expand it to other categories, like the Paramecia, we have Buffalo's Spin fruit that allows him to fly. We have Shiki's Float fruit that allows him to fly. And once you go into Logias, I mean, you could kind of say Caesar can also fly because he's lighter than air. He can make himself lighter than air, and he can fly that way, turn himself into a hot air balloon. So, yeah, in either case, I feel like Pell got some bad information on that, or maybe he just heard something from somebody that's like, oh, yeah, there's only 5. Wow, my devil fruit's really special. There's only 5 of these in the whole world. Yeah, no, there isn't. And I made a whole video on the devil fruits that allow you to fly a while back, so you could check that out for more information there. Oh, but wait, no, we're not done yet, because we still got one devil fruit reference that I want to mention here. That is page 1's Ancient Zone that allows him to turn into a Spinosaurus. Now, this one is unique because it is a change. It is a retcon that Oda made, but it's a retcon based off of information that came from our world, all right? So, Spinosaurs originally, well, I don't know if originally, I'm not a paleontologist, right? But the idea is their tails looked like this. All right, did you ever see Jurassic Park 3? Yeah, there we go. But there was a discovery, an archaeological discovery in April of 2020 while Wano was going on that it looked like Spinosaurs probably have like a webbed sort of tail because they were probably a predator that would hunt in the water. So even though Oda had already revealed the full beast form of page 1 Spinosaurus and it had this specific tail with like the ridges on it, he decided to change that later into a more streamlined tail that'd be better for fishing and using as like a sort of a rudder while you're like, swimming in the ocean or the lakes or whatever back in the day, back in like the Cretaceous, right? Okay, so that is a retcon. And by the way, retcon, it just means like regretted continuity. Like the author regretted something and he went back to change the continuity. Okay, so that's something there too. But yeah, that's the idea behind page 1, right? So it is a change, but it's a change that like Oda's like, oh, looks like the Spinosaurs didn't have a tail like that. All right, I'll change it in the story. There you go. Page 1's Devil Fruit changes depending on the understanding of paleontology in our world. Weird, but I guess that's canon now. Then we get into, I think, the thing that is retconned the most in One Piece, and that is the various heights or sizes of characters. This is something that I would imagine would be very difficult as a mangaka or a comic book artist or anybody that works with like a visual media that you have to draw the size and scale of different characters, right? Especially in One Piece where you have a lot of different size characters. Like even there's humans that are like 5 to 6 feet tall, and then other humans that are 10 feet tall, and then other humans that are 20 feet tall. You know what I mean? So it's hard to get this like exactly like, oh, how many Luffys stack up to make a Katakuri? You know what I mean? So originally when it came to Oars that we meet on Thriller Bark, the original, he was mentioned to be the size of 4 regular giants. Then Oars Jr. that we meet at Marineford was mentioned to be smaller, only the height of 2 normal giants. This was later retconned to be the same height, basically. They are around, I think, like 70 meters. I think like 67, 68 meters. Both of them are like the same height, or roughly akin to the same height. So that's about the size of like if a normal giant is around 20 meters, like Dory, Bragi, Oimokashi, we're talking about them being the height of 3 giants each, which is sort of like the middle ground. Like Oars Jr. isn't the height of 2, and Oars the original isn't the height of 4. Let's just bring them down to both be around the height of 3, okay? But nothing beats the height inconsistencies of Zunisha. And this is the thing that started this video. Like, we were talking on a live stream about the inconsistencies of stuff, and it's like we were talking about Zunisha, and it's crazy. There's a chart on the wiki that is solely dedicated to the different heights that were listed for this damn elephant, all right? Because for a long time, it was mentioned Zunisha was like 35 kilometers tall. So even if you account for like the ocean floor being like 10,000 meters down, which isn't even the case with all of the ocean floor, but Fishman Island is as low as you can go, and that's 10,000 meters down. That means that Zunisha is 20,000 meters above sea level, which puts him like way higher than even the Skypiea, like the Sky Islands and the White Sea and everything like that. It was absurd. So then that was corrected, I think, down to 5, which I think was too short, and then was corrected again to like 10,000 meters, which is like whatever, I guess. It keeps changing the length and height of Zunisha. I came up with the idea that Zunisha's legs just operate like these little stretchy tube things that you see at like the county fair or like carnivals that like, they just get bigger and smaller and contract. I'm just gonna say Zunisha's legs operate like this. That seems like something Oda could do too. So just make this canon, Oda, then everything's fine. When Zunisha's hungry and wants to eat some apples, it just extends its legs and eats some apples, and then it shrinks back down a little bit. There you go. That's all you need to do is change Zunisha's legs into these stretchy tubes, and then all of the problems are solved. There you go. But yeah, and then now we're in Elbaf. There's plenty of situations in Elbaf where like, wait, how big is Jarl compared to Bragi? Wait, is Jarl twice the size of Bragi? Are they the same height? What's going on here? So I'm a little lenient with that when it comes to, the size differences in Elbaf and in One Piece in general. It seems to be an area, not just Oda, but a lot of artists like struggle with in terms of making it consistent every single time. time in every panel, in every chapter. I imagine it would be very difficult. Yeah, this stuff is, if it's a very obvious difference, it's usually corrected in a data book or a Vivra card or in an SBS or something, right? Let's see, what else do we have here before we get to the last one? Just a few others really quick for retcons. By the way, in case you were curious, retcon, it's a combination of two words, reconsidered continuity. I don't really know why it's called retcon with a T if it's reconsidered, but hey, the language is weird. Hey, language itself has been subject to retcons as well. You know, words always like change sometimes, or the way they're spelled and written. That itself is a retcon, right? Okay, anyway, remember that time Kobe got promoted to Rear Admiral and then immediately got demoted back to Captain? I actually have maybe an explanation for why Oda, why this error exists, okay? So this was back in chapter 956 when Drake was calling Sword, the other members of Sword, okay? And Kobe picks up and it says Rear Admiral Kobe. And we were all really excited for him because we're like, wow, man, he's rising through the ranks. He's already achieved his dream of being an admiral, okay? Not an admiral, but a rear admiral. Step one. Anyway, Kobe was originally a captain before this, so he would have had to get promoted through Commodore to get to Rear Admiral. So two promotions in one. That's pretty crazy. Later on, during the official release, it was, during the Tonkobon release, it was fixed to be captain. The reason why I think Oda maybe flirted with this idea is because both Prince Groose and Kujaku, who are also members of Sword, are in fact rear admirals. So maybe Oda was planning those characters at this stage, and he was thinking, maybe Kobe should be in the same category as Prince Groose and Kujaku, so we'll make them all rear admirals. And then maybe he decided against it. He was like, actually, promoting Kobe to rear admiral like that unceremoniously with no real mention in the story, that's a little bit... maybe that doesn't work. That's just too much, you know what I mean? If he's going to get promoted, that should be something that happens in the story, right? So he changed it back to captain, right? But I think that might have been the reason, if you just want to throw out my headcanon, right? There it is. Then we also have Caesar. Caesar Clown's age was originally listed as 40 years old in a Vivra card, but then in a subsequent Vivra card later, it was changed to 55. Because Caesar was part of Mads alongside Vegapunk, Judge, and Queen. And it wouldn't make any sense. He would have had to have been like 10 years old at the time. So I'm picturing Caesar as like this little lab assistant, like this dorky little kid that's like wandering around the lab, and Queen and Judge are like barking orders at him or whatever, and that's how he grew up or whatever. He was raised by these mad scientists. But no, he was about the same age as Judge and Queen. They're all about in their mid-50s. So that's something that had to change there. There were a few others that people mentioned that might fall under the category of not so much a retcon, but more of like a mistranslation or something like that. Like that was changed later, and so that I don't count as a retcon, right? But one that kept showing up again and again, quite frequently. Luffy's Devil Fruit. So I will say, I guess this depends on authorial intent. Did Oda originally intend Luffy to have the power of a mythical zone model sun god? If Oda, when he sat down and wrote chapter 1 of this story, Romance Dawn, he was like, this devil fruit is going to be called the Gamu Gamu no Mi, but it's actually something else. Maybe he didn't even think it was the sun god fruit at the time. I'll even give him that much. Maybe Oda was just like, oh, I'll keep it Gamu Gamu no Mi for the bulk of the series, but once we start getting to the end, it's going to be revealed as something else, something greater. And then maybe later on as the story went, he hammered out exactly what that was going to be. If that was the case, if Oda intended to be the mythical zone at the very beginning, it's not a retcon. It's just something, it's a plot twist. It's something that's revealed later on in the story, right? Now, if Oda did not intend that to be the case, and he didn't decide on that until, like, chapter 476, all of a sudden Oda's like, yeah, Luffy's going to have the Sun God Fruit, but it's not going to be revealed for a while, then that would be a retcon. But the only way to know that for sure is to get Oda's take on it, for Oda to actually say something himself, for Oda to mention, like, hey, Oda, did you plan on Luffy having this from the very beginning? And Oda says, yeah, sure, totally did. Always intended to have the mythical zone model Sun God Nika. Ever since chapter 1, I already planned that. For this one, I gotta be honest, I feel like he did. I feel like with something this big for the story. And remember, Oda said that he planned on ending One Piece within like 5 years or so. It's just it kept just going and going and going, and now we're getting in on 30 years soon. But I like to think, I'll give him that maybe he didn't plan on it being exactly what it is. Like, I'm not saying like he had this whole form planned out at the very beginning. Like, this is what Luffy's going to turn into, and these are his powers, and these are his abilities. But I'll give it to him at least if he was like, yeah, there's more than meets the eye to this. This isn't just the devil fruit that turns you into rubber. There's something else here. And he kind of like, as the story progresses, I'll hammer out exactly what that is. And then he did at some point, and then here we are with Gear 5th, okay? But if you want to think it was a straight-up retcon from the beginning, go ahead. This is where we get into a difference of what is a plot twist that was always intended to, like, surprise the audience. Like, it turns out Luffy's devil fruit's actually this. What? Versus Oda being like, oh, actually, it's this now. What? And there it goes. Anyway, though, that's the video. I hope you all enjoyed. I'm sure there's still plenty of retcons that I did not mention here, so go ahead and mention them down below. Might make a sequel to this video if there's enough that I didn't bring up here. But yeah, they're different. Not all retcons, I'd say, are equal. Katakuri's devil fruit is not the same thing as, like, the door falling off the hinge and then coming back up. All right, one is, like, an art error or a mistake, just an honest mistake, Oda forgot. And another one is, like, ooh, this is something that deals with the power system that is very relevant to the story, if not changed. There you go. Anyway, hope you enjoyed, everybody. This will be Tekking signing out. Oh, I'm sorry. I went this entire video without saying what retcon was. You were probably all very confused. Retcon means recalibrated, reconsidered, rewritten, retroactive continuity. A lot of words all thrown into one. But that's what it is. That's the official definition. Yeah. Later.